Well, welcome to Gold Coast Arts. My name is Brian Gordon. I'm a senior film programmer for the Gold Coast Cinema Series and the Gold Coast International Film Festival, which takes place every year in November. And as part of our new Cultural Insider series, we'll be having a conversation today with the filmmakers of Scandalous, the Untold Story of the National Enquirer, a documentary that screened at our 2019 edition last November. And we'll be showing on this Sunday evening at 10 p.m. on CNN. And we're happy to have with us today director Mark Landsman and cinematographer Michael Pessah to discuss both the film and what projects they've been up to lately. I also want to mention that we were lucky enough to have Michael join us for the Q&A last year at the festival, and we're glad he's back with us again today with Mark. Award-winning filmmaker Mark Landsman has directed and produced numerous documentaries for television for networks and channels such as Hulu, A&E, and the Sundance Channel. And Michael is a new member of the American Society of Cinematographers, which is indeed a huge honor. And one of the latest projects has been providing the cinematography for a new series on Kiwi called The Shape of Pasta. Looking forward to that. And I want to start off with Mark for this first question. The lead-off question, what got you interested in making this film? Was there something that you saw that just triggered something, or was this something that had been brewing for a while?
That's a great question. I like to say that I didn't go out and find this film. This film found me in a very strange way. I think like a lot of us, sort of late 2015, certainly into early 2016, I found myself in a state of confusion when I would go to the grocery store and waiting in line, seeing these headlines sort of screaming at you in your face about, Hillary Clinton having, 6 months to live, or being in some sort of a satanic tryst, or, being in jail, or just, oddity after oddity of all these horrible things, befalling her. And then at the same time, those very same papers, calling Donald Trump, the coming of the Messiah. And it all felt very confusing to me. It was so overtly propagandistic. And I started to wonder, well, what's going on here? Why are these supermarket tabloids suddenly becoming political billboards in our faces? And I didn't think much of it. But then very soon after that, I got invited to a dinner, and my wife's best friend's dad was there. They were in from Lantana, Florida. And over dinner, he started to regale us with stories of his former career as a tabloid writer in the early 70s for the National Enquirer. And he just spilled the beans and just kept talking and talking. And my jaw just dropped at all of the stories that he was telling that really, blurred the lines of anything even remotely ethical. I just thought, this is a fascinating story. And so he and I just continued that dialogue. And when he came back to LA a few months later, he invited me out to lunch with some more of his Enquirer buddies, guys who had sort of been in the tabloid trenches in the early 70s with him. And they started talking like war buddies and just swapping stories. And I was very fascinated. And that's when I thought, well, I think there's a film here to be told. And that's how it happened. And all of this was actually before the New Yorker dropped the story about the potential relationship between Pecker and Trump, and certainly many months before Ronan Farrow's article about Catch and Kill.
Mm-hmm. And so when you approached some of these former writers for the National Enquirer, were people apprehensive or eager? Did people refuse, or were people saying, "Wow, it's about time"? Was there a variety of reactions?
Total mixed bag, total variety of reactions. I mean, some people never picked up the phone. Some picked up the phone and then hung it up. And then thankfully, a key contingency started to say yes. And then it was like a domino effect. Once you got this person, that series of dominoes fell. You get another person, that series. But the Enquirer is very cliquish, so it really depended on, you had to sort of get key people, and then those people who were in line with that person would say yes. It was interesting. There was a lot of diplomacy to get these people to say yes, but thankfully they did, which was remarkable.
Yeah, I thought what was really important, what was really key in your film, Mark, was including Carl Bernstein, Maggie Haberman from the New York Times, and you had a couple of other journalists in there to provide some objectivity, to kind of counterbalance these stories that these writers were talking about. Was that something you had in mind from the start?
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. I think it was really important for us to hear from people who've made a career in mainstream journalism, quote unquote legitimate journalism, people who presumably adhere to a code of ethics. And I really wanted to just have that be a counterbalance uh, to journalists who totally threw ethics out the window to do what they did. I mean, one group of journalists sort of subscribed to, like, I'm going to do anything to get the story. I'll bribe people, I'll tap phones, I'll open mail, I'll wear a disguise, I'll do whatever it takes. And another group of journalists believe that, their goal is to get the best obtainable version of the truth in an ethical fashion. So it was really great to be able to have people like that, who've made a career of being, of being ethical journalists.
Well, I thought what was particularly jaw-dropping in this film, one of the things that was jaw-dropping in this film was the story of the Elvis photo, the Elvis in the coffin photo, and to what extent, and I don't want to spoil it for viewers, but to what extent they got that, and just the whole way they set up camp in Memphis at the time of his funeral. It's a pretty amazing story, and that's almost
I love that story.
worth the film itself. Um, and did that surprise you when you heard that?
The great thing about making this movie, and Michael can attest to this, is that every story surprised us.
Mm-hmm.
Just when you thought that they had done something outlandish, something 10 times more outlandish would come out of their mouth. So, I mean, these are people who spent their careers chasing after the craziest stories, the most outrageous requests from their editors, and they did all kinds of crazy things to get them. So the stories, I mean, I would turn to Michael and we would be like, can you believe what this person is saying? We're sitting on the other side of the camera, like going, whoa, that's nuts. But it was true.
And Michael, how did your how did the subject matter and what you were doing kind of affect your camera choices? And how did you collaborate with Mark on this?
I'll answer those questions in reverse order. I'd known Mark for many years because we went to film school together. We both were fellows at the American Film Institute, and we immediately became fast friends there. And I was a huge fan of one of his earlier feature documentaries, a movie called Thunder Soul. And I remember going to the screening of Thunder Soul and just loving it so much, and always thought that if an opportunity came to collaborate on something with Mark, it'd be something I would move mountains to do. I'd really look forward to having that chance to do that. And Mark reached out to me at this point, I think it was more than 2 years ago, and said, I've got a great idea for a movie, let's get lunch. And then we sat down and he explained the story of it. And of course, anyone that hear about it, this sort of journey through American history, through the National Enquirer, it's going to be an incredible, engaging and interesting and challenging documentary. And of course, I jumped at the chance to collaborate with him on it. In terms of the way it's photographed, I think, we had a lot of conversations about how to film the interviews in this movie. And that's important because it's difficult once you start going out on a track about the visual storytelling. It's in a documentary, it's very difficult to go back and change course, right? You already have certain interviews that have been, set to film or recorded in a particular style, and the tendency is to kind of carry that through. And part of the visual pattern that we designed for this film is that we wanted the imagery of the interviews to have the kind of sensationalistic and vibrant quality of a great National Enquirer photograph. Yeah. And we wanted that sense of sort of life and pizzazz and showmanship that is there in the National Enquirer. And when you see the movie, so much of the film is concerned with the imagery of the National Enquirer and the power of the photograph and the power of the image, right? In many ways, it's it's a film about the power of imagery, right? Like when you talked about the Elvis's photograph, that whole story is about getting one frame. And so we wanted the interviews to reflect the sensationalistic quality of a great National Enquirer image, except for the objective interviews, which you alluded to earlier. And those we filmed in a sort of more subdued color palette and in a slightly more kind of sotto voce tonality. And so if you look at the movie closely, there's a little bit of a break in terms of the way that the Enquirer reporters are photographed and the way the objective journalists are photographed. And we tend to have a little bit of a visual design around the way those two sides of the story are captured.
Well, I really certainly noticed that myself. And I think that's an interesting point for people who've seen lots of documentaries. And, you think of documentaries, well, there's a lot of interviews and you may not think about, how the talking heads, so to speak, are framed or what's behind them. And I think when you watch this film, you just pay attention to that. And it's, you'll really see a subtle difference. It's not necessarily blatant, but you will notice a subtle difference between the way the writers are photographed as opposed to Carl Bernstein. So that just really adds a nice extra element to ticking in the film, I have to say.
Well, I always believe that good cinematography should be felt, but not always noticed. And so hopefully that carries through in Scandalous also, where people feel these choices and they inform the way they react to the movie and the way they react to these very, very interesting people that are talking to us. But it's not so much that it's drawing their mind away from it.
Exactly. And Mark, I know we sort of alluded to this earlier, but of course, one of the terms that's been kicked around for the last 4 or 5 years is the term fake news. And I'm sure it's been around for a long time. But would you say that the National Enquirer, even before the Pecker era, pretty much catalyzed that, or just really kind of shifted it into a higher gear?
I wouldn't say that they catalyzed it, because it's really an intrinsic part of American history. It goes back to the dawn of the Republic. There's always been quote unquote fake news. There's always been news that's been agenda or bias driven. If you go back to the very, very earliest days of the Federalists, but really, I would say that the National Enquirer perfected the art of manipulating truth, manipulating fact. If you talk to, one of the real legendary reporters, just a total veteran of the Enquirer for 30 plus years, said that it was fake-ish, just as it was true-ish. So what they would do is they called it exploding the nub, where they would take a story that had a kernel of truth and they would sensationalize that kernel, so that you were so focused on the smoke and mirrors that you really didn't care about paying attention to the fact that the story was not really fully accurate. So they certainly took that to a different level and fabricated all kinds of things off of that kernel of truth. Somebody may have seen something in the sky near Roswell, but the fact of the matter is that it probably was not an alien invasion. But if you read the Enquirer headline, you sure would have thought it was. And they did that really with everything, whether it was like Liz Taylor and her latest love affairs or her ebbs and flows of weight, or whether it was a medical cure or an oddity of some kind. They just did that across the board. Yeah, and I think the problem with the Enquirer, the danger of it, is that certainly in the mid-90s, when it started to kind of get more quote unquote investigative in its journalism, really around O.J. Simpson, the murder trial of O.J. Simpson and the Bruno Magli shoes, you have a paper that is presenting journalism that sort of looks like legitimate journalism, looks like what's something you might read in the New York Times or the Boston Globe or the Washington Post or the Tribune. But then that article is on the same page with some sort of an outrageous, outlandish piece of celebrity gossip or supernatural phenomena. and the viewers, the reader starts to kind of get confused. Well, is this journalism or is it not? And do I care because I'm still reading it? So I think that's where it becomes very interesting in terms of the Enquirer's role in, buffing the edges of what we think is a fact, or even buffing the edges of whether or not we think a fact is important in journalism.
And of course, that sort of leads into the fact that our president plays a pivotal role in the film, not just in the last, not just during the 2016 elections, but prior. As you started on, and the film, without going against, but this will make you, I'm sure this will make you want to watch it more. But the film includes, some old tapes of phone recordings and some of the stuff that Mr. Trump did, I guess back in the 90s, was it, when he was like calling in stories as pretending to be somebody else. It's pretty amazing, and if not surprising. Um, uh, when you heard those, I mean, were you like blown away?
No, I wasn't, because I sort of expected that. I wasn't surprised. I mean, I grew up in the era where he was, a tabloid person.
Yeah.
He was a bit in tabloids, and he was fodder for gossip, and he was a showman and a carnival barker. So I mean, it's kind of like, so it wasn't surprising to me to see that. And I had known about the existence of these recordings and things like that. So it wasn't like a big discovery, but it is remarkable to see this symbiotic relationship between the National Enquirer and Donald Trump, and how they used each other almost
Absolutely.
like host and parasite and host, over the course of years, and how that then became this tool that he had in his belt for reaching an audience that he previously hadn't. So it's kind of extraordinary. And of course, obviously The Apprentice has a huge part to do in it, but The Enquirer it started with the Daily News and the New York Post in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And him being quite masterful at knowing how to work those tabloids and having people on the inside who were servicing him. And then it very naturally fed into the Enquirer. But it really wasn't until the Pecker era where it became, I would say, something more concerning.
Right. Well, I think what really comes off in this film, for especially for those who, like you, may have walked by the going at the checkout line at the supermarket and just seeing it there on display and just rolling your eyes and just, God, but who believes all that stuff? Who would believes that? There's that attitude. I think this film is sort of, in some ways, is kind of an eye opener for people like me and other people like that, just to see how significant a role it's played, in American culture, beyond just the whole tabloid thing. Just in the way it helped craft fake news, and its roles in the different scandals. And the film is really good in the sense it really gives you kind of take a tour of some of the different scandals and big that happened. I mean, we talked about Elvis and OJ, but there's also Gary Hart, and there's also Princess Diana, which was certainly a low point in their in the paper's existence. And it really forces the viewer to kind of see all this again from their perspective, and it makes you really think about what and just the role they played, and what's become of journalism, and how mainstream journalism has in some ways has taken their cues from what the Enquirer has done.
Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the interesting things about this movie in terms of the filming it is that so much of this film is Mark interviewing and trying to elicit stories from folks that are masters at being on the other side of that looking glass. And it's Mark interviewing master reporters and storytellers, and very, very agile folks at crafting their own narrative and crafting other people's narratives. And in some ways, the tables are turned a bit. And so when you see a documentary, there's an amazing story that leads up to the very first time you see a frame of an interview on the screen, right? Mm-hmm. Can you get this person to agree to do an interview? where do you film it? In what way is that interview filmed? How much time do you have with them? How truthful are they going to be with the director, and how persistent is that director going to be to kind of elicit some truth from them? And that's one of the wonderful parts about this type of storytelling. And each one of these interviews, even before you see a frame of it, was in some ways a kind of master chess match between interviewer and interviewee. These were very, very savvy folks to be talking to that are very, very good at not saying things that they don't want to say in front of a camera, right? Some of them have been, pestered by reporters or on the other side of the relationship for 30 or 40 years, or even more. And so it was so wonderful to see this kind of chess match play out in real time between interviewer and interviewee throughout the process of this movie. So every time you see a soundbite or a clip in this film, there's a lot of times there's a whole story or a whole conversation that preceded that was fascinating to watch.
Okay, well, that is definitely something to maybe reflect on after you see the film. Maybe not necessarily think about it while it's going on, but certainly something to reflect and something to, give the viewer some more of a background about documentary filmmaking. I really appreciate you saying that. Mark, I know that you're doing the interviews for this film, and when it's going to be airing at 10 o'clock on Sunday evening. You have any other irons in the fire right now?
Yeah, as a independent documentary filmmaker, as an independent filmmaker, period, I think that your survival is incumbent upon, always juggling, having all kinds of things on the burners. So I'm always in development on projects, and I have a number of projects that I'm developing. I'm working on a documentary series right now for a new network called Quibi, which is a mobile network that Jeffrey Katzenberg is behind. Michael has shot a wonderful show for that. And so that's been a great project. So we're just moving forward, always really open and intrigued with meaningful stories, looking for ways to tell them and get them supported. And
Michael, you're working on a pasta documentary for Quibi?
Yeah, that just went live a few weeks ago. The film is called The Shape of Pasta, and we traveled with a renowned chef throughout all the little regions and little towns in Italy for about 2 months last summer. And he learns lost pasta making techniques from these nonas that are throughout these tiny towns in Italy. And it's you will want to make your own pasta, and you will be very, very hungry after you watch this film. And it was a great travelogue and a great way of visiting sort of a culture that in many ways is disappearing as well. So The Shape of Pasta, it was the name of that show, and it was quite a lovely experience filming it.
Great. Oh, don't watch that on the stomach.
And then coming up, there's I'm wrapping up post of a feature film about this very, very interesting Russian composer whose name was Masalov. And this was a beautiful film that we actually shot on film in Moscow that is going through post-production right now. And look out for that one too.
Absolutely. And just in case people don't miss the screening on the airing at 10 o'clock on Sunday, this will be repeated. It will be on demand on CNN.
Yes, this will be screening. So Sunday is the premiere, and it will be edited. It will be shown largely uninterrupted. It will be 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Pacific Time, and they're going to air it again on the West Coast. And then they'll air it regularly. You'll see it. CNN will, with their films, they continue to air them, so you'll see it. But Sunday is the opportunity to see the one that is uninterrupted.
Great. Well, Mark and Michael, I really appreciate your time. Again, we had Mark Landsman, the director of Scandalous, the Untold Story of the National Enquirer, which is now told on this film, and Michael Pessah, the cinematographer, who's nuanced with some really beautiful nuanced cinematography with the interviews for the film. And we really appreciate your time. And do please remember to support the Gold Coast Arts Center. And thank you so much for watching.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks. Stay safe, everybody.